Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from Teyana Taylor, titled VII. You know, it's always interesting as a critic that covers pop music in any way to take note of major trends. And the easiest way to do that is to take notes of the acts that seemingly debut from almost out of nowhere, with unexpected sudden waves of buzz, or just the right amount of propulsion to launch themselves into the mainstream conversation, or in the critical discussion, whether or not we want them or not. And where new bro country releases dominated 2013, particularly the latter half of that year, 2014 will likely be remembered as the year where R&B and soul returned en masse, with a slew of debut artists for both the mainstream and in the independent spheres. And in a nice change of pace from the male-dominated wave of bro country, most of the debuting R&B acts these days are women, with SZA, FKA Twigs, Banks, Jhené Aiko, and Tinashe all bringing distinctly different sounds and levels of quality to the table. But what is notable is to look behind the scenes and see where these acts are really coming from, who's pushing them, as it seems like most of the major labels are fighting to get their R&B starlet in the spotlight to mixed degrees of success, because let's be honest, Ariana Grande is probably going to crush most of them anyways. But the label that appears to be throwing the most of their money into the R&B game right now is Def Jam. They've already launched Jhené Aiko and are looking to add to the scene with Teyana Taylor, a New York R&B singer who is most notable outside of the music scene for appearing on the soul-crushing reality show MTV's My Super Sweet 16, a show where spoiled rich teenagers have ludicrously expensive 16th birthday parties and act like generally terrible human beings. So, okay, not a good sign, but you know what, to be fair to her, that was around 7 years ago. Most people are terrible human beings when they're teenagers, and most of them grow out of it. And she's been around the music scene long enough since then to have probably developed some common sense, or at least some very good connections. Originally signed to Pharrell's personal label Star Trek, she later connected with Kanye West, and apparently hit it off so well with him that she landed some vocal pieces on My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy in 2010, and eventually was signed to Kanye's Good Music, where she appeared on the compilation album Cruel Summer, and now has finally dropped her debut album VII, which apparently was very heavily inspired by 90s R&B stars like Janet Jackson, Lauryn Hill, and Mary J. Blige. And coupled with Kanye West's executive producer credit on this debut album, okay, that was enough to get me curious enough to check this out. How is it? Funny thing, remember how I said that Teyana Taylor was heavily inspired by 90s R&B? Well, you can tell, because it's a record that was firmly wedged within two worlds. The slick, classier brand of R&B that you found 15 to 20 years ago, and the dirtier, grimier, more explicit R&B you get nowadays. And this leads to a record that's arguably better when rehashing the past than it is when talking about the present. And yet I make the argument it's still pretty damn good regardless. Not the best R&B album I've heard thus far this year. Jhené Aiko still pretty firmly has that title, at least for me, but it's far from the worst, and overall, I enjoyed this. I liked this album. So let's start with Teyana herself. And while I won't say that I'm blown away by her voice, there's a fair amount of gravitas and poise, more than I would typically expect. She doesn't show off a huge sweeping vocal range, but she's definitely capable of showing up a ton of real raw emotion that does come across as genuine, which I'd argue is a hell of a lot more important. What's even better is that she's mastered the ability of making songs sound very sexual without needing to resort to explicit language. Everything is implied on this album, which I'd argue is a hell of a lot more attractive. And yet there's still maturity here as well. Not only does she know what she wants, she refused to play the weak-willed girl who is easily swayed by the bad boys. And considering the bad boys you have on this album are Chris Brown, Pusha T, Yo Gotti, and Fabulous, that's saying something. And speaking of our guest stars, okay, honestly, it's a bit of a mixed bag. The best verse, unsurprisingly, comes courtesy of Pusha T, who, despite sounding sleazy as always, does show how he'll back up Teyana in a wingman sort of role as her label mate. But Yo Gotti doesn't quite do as well, mostly because his rougher street rapper voice isn't as great of a fit over this smoother trap-inspired production. And Fabulous's voice on Broken Hearted Girl takes the lecherous side of the hookup track, and then shows some truly embarrassing wordplay on a purely technical level. Plus, no self-respecting person should ever use hashtags in conversation. I'm sorry, it's just sad. Now, the big surprise for me was courtesy of Chris Brown on Do Not Disturb, where he and Teyana have some pretty solid musical chemistry, and he mostly speaks to his expressive upper range. Now, I still don't like it whenever there's rough sex mentioned in a song with Chris Brown, but to be fair here, at least the lines are courtesy of Teyana being in control, which for me was a real welcome change. Now, this takes us to production and instrumentation. And as I mentioned earlier, this album is effectively split right down the middle between songs that wouldn't sound out of place in the mid to late 90s and songs that work on mainstream R&B radio right now. And look, I'd be lying if I said I didn't prefer more of the former. If anything, the contrast only highlights why. Songs like Request with the delicate flutter of the harps or the piano ballad Sorry that could have been lifted easily and directly from Mariah's late 90s work are a lot more melodic and sensual than most of the harsher sounding R&B you get today. And I'd take them over the reverse synth leads on Just Different, the effects on the back of Broken Hearted Girl that sound like they're constantly dying out, or the eerie sounding trap, hi-hats, and thick bass that punctuates most of the rest of this album. Hell, both the interludes should have been stretched into full songs, performed with its guitar and bass balances grating against the rattling percussion, the second with the dramatic strings and guitar stings with a subtle male backing chorus. Both songs, pretty awesome. They could have held up songs on their own. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't some more modern tracks that aren't good here. I dug the bass-heavy reggae vibe with the steel drums on Put Your Love On, which is unlike anything else on this album, was an easy highlight. The piano and guitar interplay on Business against the snare drum beat, that was pretty solid. And hell, the dark trap vibe and In the Air was appropriate for the angry, dark tone of the song. And the backing vocals were definitely welcome and well executed there. That said, if we're looking for production issues, they mostly fell on the more modern sounding songs, courtesy of just too much pitch correction on tracks like Just Different, or the interjection of gang vocals, which, once again, they don't fit on this album. They aren't needed here at all. But at this point, we have to talk about songwriting. And look, I'd be lying if I said that the record's songwriting topics strayed far from your traditional typical R&B. We had songs about complicated and failing relationships, and a fair number of songs about sex and hookups. It's not exactly new, and if I'm being honest, I wouldn't say a lot of the poetry is all that stellar or all that descriptive either. That being said though, there are some highlights that I did appreciate and did knock this album up a couple notches into my good books. For one, despite showing some real vulnerability, I liked how there was a real assertiveness to Teyana Taylor's writing that did reflect a certain amount of poise and self-control. Her prodding to get her partner to open up about his fantasies on Request, her weary acknowledgments on Broken Hearted Girl that it really is just gonna be a one-night stand that she's taking because she's been heartbroken and she just needs to get over it, and she's kind of okay with that, or the assertions that her partner that they don't need to divulge details about their sex lives or relationships to their friends on Business, which is definitely a sentiment I can get behind. But for me, the two lyrical highlights are right next to each other. The first being Dreams, where she calls out another R&B artist, Tory Lanez, who made a song that was decidedly creepy, where he said he was dreaming about screwing her. The great thing here is about how Teyana responded to it. Not with anger, but with pure disdain that he did not come correct, which is helped by the fact that I'm fairly certain that her voice is deeper than his is. And then that song is followed by Sorry, easily my favorite track on this album, directed at an ex where she shows remorse that she couldn't reciprocate some of his feelings. It had to break his heart. It's a mature sounding breakup song that acknowledges what didn't work, and she doesn't have any ill feelings towards him other than just empathy. And in a world where so many artists opt for bitterness or resentment or stupid games with ex-boyfriends or girlfriends, Teyana takes the high road, and you know what? That does show a lot for me, and that does knock this album up a fair bit. So at the end of the day, okay, you know what? I like this. I won't say that it's doing anything new in terms of content or delivery or instrumentation, which does hold it back from me really loving this album, but in terms of a slick, pretty short R&B debut, it shows a level of maturity, poise, and intellect that I definitely appreciated. For me, I'm thinking a light 7 out of 10, a pretty good album if you're looking for another fix of consistent R&B that calls back to the past and present, so it is a recommendation. If you're looking for an album like this, 7 by Teyana Taylor will definitely deliver. So go check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. As for the comments, what do you guys think of the split between modern and classic R&B on this record? Think it worked? I certainly did. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.